everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Ayman McAdam. Another brief apology from me this time, because I think I didn't release an episode last week. And again, I have another good reason. I've been working very hard on this new video essay, Where Are the Arabs? Tentatively also called Arab Nationalism, a Postmortem, but I think that sounds a bit too dramatic. And I'm pretty much done with the script, I think. I read through it again last night, and I mean, there's still a bit of work to do, but I think I'm going to film in the next few days, and then edit at least a rough cut that I'll hopefully have done by the end of the week, and hopefully I'll get this out before the new year. Also, this episode is, it's 10 days from now, but I'm coming up to 1 year of this podcast, and it's kind of crazy, but also weird how I don't feel much towards that. Because I don't know, doing this podcast at once, it always feels a bit unnatural, sitting and talking to it takes me a while, like when I send voice notes, to get the gears in motion until I feel comfortable of what I'm saying. But either way, but also, yeah, it feels like I've always been doing this, because I've always been talking. But yeah, it's been a year, or it's gonna be a year, and that's pretty big. I think this episode, it's gonna be quite personal. I feel like just talking about personal things that are not necessarily political. Most of the stuff I talk about in this podcast is personal and political, but I think the things that I've been feeling that I've been neglecting have been the purely personal. And I'm gonna give myself some space to share some of this stuff with all of you, because if there's one thing that this podcast is not reinforcing, but potentially reinforces, is sometimes I've had the tendency to over talk. In the last few years, I've gotten much better at listening. I've always been a decent listener, but as in constantly checking myself. But obviously, recording this podcast alone, there's no one, I don't know, there's not, I don't stop to hear other people's opinions. It's just me talking. But at the same time, I do have to be aware. And, it's always useful to remind myself there are people listening. And even though you cannot talk back, you are having thoughts about what I'm saying. And we're sort of forming a relationship. Hopefully in not too intensive a way, but, I've listened to podcasters, I've followed people. I formed these kind of parasocial relationships. Not necessarily toxic ones, but as in, there's a conversation in my head that they don't even know exists. But so, yeah. I'm going to talk about some recent stuff and some things that I'm thinking of just doing differently, especially in the new year, but basically starting from now. I have a theory about New Year's resolutions that you shouldn't do it in the new year. You should start just before. Because then the shift into the new year is not as dramatic. That's honestly the logic I went into it making this podcast. I released the first episode on December 28th. And there was a part of my mind I want to keep doing this throughout the year. But it wasn't a New Year's resolution with all the weight that comes with it. And it's kind of held. I've done, I think this is the 53rd episode. I've basically almost done one episode a week for the entire year, which, kind of proud of. I definitely don't think I was sure that would be the case when I first decided. Anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit, obviously, about Syria, a little bit about the so-called ceasefire in Lebanon, but mostly I'm just going to talk about some shit I'm dealing with and how I'm going to be thinking about this podcast, my work, and my, place in the world as a podcaster, under capitalism as a writer. Yeah. And before I do that, brief reminder. It's funny because I'll bring this up a bit later on. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and if you want to keep listening, if you want to keep this podcast going, if you want to support me, please consider joining the Patreon. There's a link below. Also, I've just opened up a Ko-fi, which is kind of like Buy Me a Coffee. It's the same principle. It's a place to give one-time donations. It's a tip jar. You can do monthly subscriptions, but I think most people use it for one-time stuff. I started to feel like Buy Me a Coffee was a bit gimmicky, and I don't know, Ko-fi, I think the name, it originally was the same concept of like, oh, for a price of a cup of coffee, but there's none of that. It's just, here's my page, you like my stuff, give me a few dollars, tip. But Patreon, you also get exclusive content, an invitation to our monthly hangout, which last time was actually really, really great. It was like 20 of us, and just a really cool conversation. A lot of really cool people. Anyway, so it's very funny giving that as like an advertisement, because that's something I want to talk about more generally. I've been not doing amazing financially. I mean, I'm all right because I'm not the only, let's say, income in this household. But I don't know. There is a specific thing that I'd applied for, which is like a fellowship, to basically continue doing the work I'm already doing, but to get paid to do it, which is the dream. And it didn't work out. And it was just yet another failed or like rejection for a writing / artistic grant. I basically have 100% fail rate with writing and film grants and art grants. I don't know why. I think the work I do is interesting. I think I'm interesting. I think I have something to say, and I have the ability to do it and whatever. But just, it's been like 7 years of rejections. Maybe I'm just not good at writing grants, but my impression is it's not what they're looking for. And I don't know, I've always hated the whole process of spending so much time writing the grant, getting rejected, and the waiting period, but also all the effort and labor. And basically all these projects are on hold until you get the funding, which is part of the reason why I started doing this podcast to begin with, because it's like, fuck it, I'm just going to do it. Not wait for funding, because I don't need funding to make these episodes. But with that comes the fact that I keep having to like push the Patreon, push the tip jar, market myself in that way, which was always part of the job. But yeah, I don't know. I've been feeling really uncomfortable about it. And I am now, what I'm thinking now moving ahead is sort of like configuring the way that I conceptualize this work. And me plugging myself or reminding people about the Patreon or opening up this Ko-fi thing and being like, hey, give me a few dollars. Because it just, to me, feels weird in this moment of collapse back home. Like, all these fundraisers for people in Gaza, for example. And there's this I had a really great conversation with someone actually who explained it a bit differently to me. But basically how I conceive it, or how I perceive it rather, is that like social media is like one big square. And if you're coming in with something, you're detracting attention from something else. And that's definitely how it's like the illusion of social media is. Obviously, it does not function like that whatsoever. But that kind of thing of each tweet is equal. And so, I don't know. It just feels weird scrolling on the same timeline, and it feels like putting myself above them. This person who talked to me, we talked like today actually, a very, very cool person who I'm so happy to have recently met, queer comrade, that no, it's not one big square, and that a lot of the people who would give money for like a media thing or for this podcast are not necessarily the same people who would otherwise donate to a GoFundMe. And these are like different demographics, different people. I'm sure there's overlap, but like I am not detracting. And again, I'm not talking about, first of all, I'm talking about those things, but second of all, it's not a distraction. I don't know. I think it's my own neurotic bullshit and fear of looking like I'm a bit removed from reality. Look what's happening back home. How could you be, posting the stuff I mean, I'm not, I don't know. Whatever. I just need to give myself more benefit of the doubt and just do it. Do it. If most of it is my head, no one has told me anything like this. There's just a fear of certain perceptions from others. But there's like a discomfort for sure that I'm going to try and overcome. I am going to push the Patreon more. I am going to push like the tip jar more. I'm going to start doing more exclusive content, but at the same time keep pushing people to be like, hey, the reason this is free is because some people are paying, and so if you want to keep it going, chuck us a few quid, or a few dollars. I don't know why I like the word quid. Yeah. But so anyway, I hope to change that mindset, because otherwise this isn't that sustainable for me, but I want to. And I want it to be, and I'm dedicated to making it sustainable. And I think the video essays expands the scope of my reach, let's call it. And I don't know, more YouTube stuff I might lean towards. That was a very Yoda sentence. I'm sorry, you're kind of getting free association at the moment. I have actually been doing psychoanalysis for the last 4 weeks, and it's been great. It's exactly what I imagined it to be. And it is basically what I've already done with myself for like 10 years, 12 years, which is that constantly questioning, but also letting the mind go and then pulling back and then like talk and explore and then pick up patterns. But yeah, so I am definitely going to be much more out there, let's say, on social media. I don't know if people know, I have an Instagram. I'm also now writing a lot more on Blue Sky. And yeah, I don't know. I do think like the rejection literally came the day that Bashar al-Assad fell. So it was very hard to take it like to be very sad necessarily. But I think now it's sort of, yeah. It was kind of too good to be true, honestly. But I don't know. Basically now I might apply to a grant here or there, but I am going to be trying as hard as possible to basically do the work and kind of sell the work, like make money from the work itself as opposed to get money to do the work, which is honestly kind of like the traditional thing. I mean, not really. For a very long time, there have always been like patrons of the art that give a lot of money for artists to just like do their shit. But yeah, and it's a job. I shouldn't feel bad. I'm not asking like, hey, it's not a favor. It's like, I don't know, it's a service, it's a labor, it's something I've done. I'm sorry, I don't know how this all sounds, but I have realized that, and again, now being back in therapy, that I do have a very strong tendency to not just acknowledge that the personal is political, but to politicize the personal, or maybe to personalize the political so much so that they're inseparable. And so I find myself genuinely, if someone asks me how I'm doing, there's not really a register of my body or how I'm doing. It's like completely tied to what's happening in Gaza, to what was happening in Lebanon, what continues to happen in Lebanon. I'll talk a bit about that now, actually. But also what's happened in Lebanon for the last 5 years. And then Syria as well. So like the last 2 weeks, I've been doing pretty good because for the first time in a very long time, there's a kind of a balance. But also, I do think I hit a kind of low with the last few days of the escalation of the aggression in Lebanon. that I've kind of, I think, hit a stasis. I think I went numb, and I'm not really over it. And it's really funny because the day the ceasefire was announced, the rebel offensive in the north was really gaining steam in Syria. And so there really wasn't a moment to process. But even if that didn't happen, the Israelis have continued to attack sites in Lebanon and targets in Lebanon and have committed massacres. I think the number at the moment is about 430 violations in the last 21 days or so. Actually, the day before I recorded the last episode, yeah, I said I was going to do an episode on the ceasefire, the so-called ceasefire. But I'm going way past the thing that I was originally talking about, so I'll circle back. So basically, I do think it's kind of unhealthy, obviously, to completely tie the political and the personal. Again, even though when I'm talking about these things, we're talking about home. But yeah. And so on this podcast, I think I've somewhat enabled myself to continue building that connection. Politically depressed, and I'm here, but it's a personal podcast. But it is difficult to separate, and I don't think you ever can fully separate them. But give myself a little time to just be myself as a human in this space with these emotions. So like in therapy, I find what's very funny is that I don't really talk that much about politics, actually. I did a lot, first of all. I mean, I do, but I used to so much with the German therapist, but I think I was kind of proving a point. Or rather, because I know or I have suspicions of his politics, I find myself talking about whatever. But in this space, with this Lebanese therapist, there's certain things I don't have to explain, or I don't feel like I want to explain, or there are certain topics which I feel are assumed. Maybe it's just like I get through it quicker because I don't have to talk that much about it. But either way, I tend towards for instance, I've been having very bizarre dreams these days of my school days, which I never did. It's been years, but for like 2 or 3 days, I've been dreaming of people I haven't thought about in years. And all of a sudden, I'm there again, but I'm a bit transformed. I'm not as much of a pushover. Or for instance, I did have a dream where I was back in Beirut, but this time, for the very first time, I think ever, but definitely in recent memory, that I was in like an old apartment that we lived in for like 2 years. And I don't know why I was in that apartment, like very specifically. But anyway, so yeah, I kind of also want to liberate myself a bit from the constraints, some of which I have set for myself, of like always feeling the need in order to stay fully relevant, to feel connected with the relevance of the moment, to constantly talk politics, to constantly talk about updates or what's happening, and sometimes give myself a bit of space, in the spaces I've created, essentially, to talk about myself outside of it, some things that aren't necessarily fully related. Which, again, I have done to give myself some credit. I haven't only been doing like political analysis on this podcast for the last year. But yeah, I mean, because ultimately the thing is so many of the things that we're forced to deal with in my region as Arabs, and specifically in the Levant, it's forced on us. Like I talk so much about Zionism. I don't want to fucking talk about Zionism anymore. Like we're talking about war. We're talking about, I mean, at the moment, literally genocide. And it's just, we always talk about this. We have to talk about this. There's some things that like we can never stay silent about while it's still happening and even after it's happened. But what's so frustrating is that we then become purely connected to those things and we're unable to be people outside of it, other than these things. And I find that a bit suffocating, to be honest. And it's fine. I mean, this is like deep kind of therapy talk. Like, I'm not going boo hoo, I can't talk about my poetry. But yeah, anyway, I do think it's important to have some space for yourself. Take care of yourself. No, my mother tells me this thing, and I probably have mentioned this in the podcast before, but I always like bringing up my mother's wisdom, um, which is kind of, she tells me the story all the time, like, Eamon, what did they tell you on a plane if the cabin pressure drops and the masks drop? Put on the mask on yourself before helping the person next to you, especially if it's a child. And I like that. I like that. I can't do anything unless I'm taken care of. I can't take care of others unless I'm taken care of. And allowing myself that space to not think that it's being selfish or disconnected from the reality. Honestly, this thing of disconnection I think is huge, and I really need to examine it, especially now being essentially a diaspora. And in the Lebanese diaspora, there is so many problematic behavior patterns and attitudes and politics straight up. But our perceptions, before I was a diaspora, um, there was just like a condescension because of that disconnect. The romanticization of Lebanon, for instance, or I don't know, a lot of things. It just, there were so many things that we would see and we would hear about that were never connected to our everyday life. And so I am honestly very nervous all the time about being seen as, outside, essentially irrelevant, disconnected from the ground. And what's difficult about, I guess, the diasporic experience is that I am not on the ground. In the last 2, maybe 3 years, I've only been back twice. Last time was only for a week. And even in those moments, I'm there on vacation, essentially. And I have some, lost that feeling of, and I mean, part of it, that's why I left. I couldn't handle it. But in some sense, I've identified with it so strongly. And that so many of my friends, all of my friends really, are still living it. Well, not all of my friends, but regardless, because again, a lot of other people left as well. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know why that is so important. That's something I'm definitely going to talk about with my therapist, I guess. Because it makes me very nervous when doing some of these things, or writing, or posting. It's like, I think it is that sense of identity that it can be stripped away if it is too, like, let's say, localized or based on a physical being there. I think that's why Edward Said, for the last few years, has been so huge for me, because he, like most Palestinians, do not cannot go back. They have this identity, they have this belonging, but they're never allowed to physically manifest it. And this is the experience, of the exilee, essentially. And Edward Said wrote a lot about the experience, but also the forms of being in exile. And I don't know. Again, I do not compare myself to people in exile. I'm still able to go back. I still have a home, it's there. But that separation is still something that I identify with. That longing, but also there's a slight resentment as well, a resentment for the longing. It's why when I wrote this short graphic novel, A Letter Home, it wasn't nostalgic. It was a bit bitter nostalgia, let's say. I am nostalgic, but at the same time aware that I have a toxic relationship with Beirut, but also with the nostalgia for Beirut, which again has a longer history. Anyway, I think that's it. I think there's definitely something I need to think about a lot more vis-a-vis why I feel so whatever, and why I feel so threatened or vulnerable about that sense of identity. I used to have more of an identity crisis. I'm a bit more comfortable with myself. I'm a lot more comfortable with myself now. But on this issue, it still remains. And I don't know why. I don't know why. But anyway, so on that, this has been another episode of Politically Depressed. As I said, I am now going full steam with marketing this podcast, with marketing my work, with trying to make this sustainable. So, if you're listening to this podcast, if you like the sound of my voice, you like the stuff I share, you like the space that I've created here, or from any of my other projects, please consider supporting me. There's a tip jar below, which is now coffee.com/AmonMac. Again, the link down there. But also, for those real ones, you can become a member of our Patreon. And yeah, you get access to a lot of cool stuff. And for $5 a month, you really help us grow. And you get an invitation to the monthly hangout. And become part of the From the Periphery family. We haven't agreed to that language, but I guess maybe that's the first use of the term. You heard it here first, folks. Anyway. Alright. Thanks everyone for listening, and see you all in the next one.